This is Abacus. I'm Bob, the CPA. One of the most daunting parts of any job search is the interviews. After all, interviewing is a skill set that you've never been taught and you hardly ever use. Yet you're supposed to be great at it if you want the job. It's a stressful situation that leaves the best of us feeling overwhelmed. That's why I've asked interview coach Margaret to come on the show and help demystify the process.
I'm an interview coach who helps professionals to get hired, promoted, and paid more.
She'll tell you about the worst interviewing myths that keep people like you from landing the job, the best way to prepare for an interview, and you'll get to hear about one of the worst interviews she's ever seen. And then, in today's coaching note, I'll tell you about a free way to avoid the biggest accounting resume mistakes. All this coming up on Abacus. Let's go. Learn everything you need to know to have a successful and fulfilling accounting career. Whether you're on the partner track or you're making your own path, this is Abacus. All right, well, let's get into it. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question is, how would you describe yourself in one or two sentences?
Okay, I would say I'm an interview coach who helps professionals to get hired, promoted, and paid more.
And what is your background with, or your experience in interviewing?
Okay, so quite an extensive one. I have about 11 years of international recruitment experience. I've spent 11 years in recruitment in total. I spent the first few years recruiting for technology companies such as Microsoft, VMware, Business Objects, or TIBCO software. Recruiting for different positions in sales and marketing, technology, finance, HR, really across the board. From more junior positions up to VP level, and truly across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I think in Europe, I must have worked on at least one position in, I think, every country in Europe, or most countries in Europe. I've done quite a bit of recruitment in the US. Actually, when I worked for Expedia, I filled, 10, 15 positions in Seattle. One was in New York as well. And in some of my previous jobs, I've done some recruitment in the Middle East and some in Africa as well. But obviously Europe is where I do most of the recruitment. So, UK and Germany and France, but I still recruit in the US. I'm a head of recruitment also at Yieldify. So I'm currently doing quite a bit of recruitment for our office in New York.
Wonderful. And do you have any history of working with accounting and finance professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started my career in recruitment, actually my first ever job was a recruitment agency specializing in accounting and finance positions. So I've recruited for a number of positions, including, accounts payable and finance manager and finance analyst, et cetera, et cetera. And I've also recruited for these positions at Expedia. So again, I have pretty extensive experience of recruiting for finance analysts, finance managers, finance directors, but also as an interview coach, I've worked with, people at all levels. I've worked with hedge fund guys and asset management guys.
Wonderful. I like to get that out of the way first so everybody can understand that you know what you're talking about and just sit back and listen to the advice for the rest of the show. So thank you for that. One of the hardest things about interviewing is that so much of the process is out of your control. It's frustrating to spend so much time preparing only to have fate kick you to the curb. But Margaret tells me this is completely normal. And so jumping into the actual interview process, I think like a lot of things in life, interviewing, there's a lot of things you can't control in the process. Are there any examples you have of that and how you should handle them when you're going into an interview?
Yeah, I think the only thing you can control is how you come across. Like you can do your best, but the rest is completely beyond your control. I'm sure you've had that experience, or you've had someone who had an experience of doing a fantastic interview, and you still won't get the job because maybe there was someone with slightly more relevant experience, or there was another candidate who maybe has been recommended by someone internally. So, and sometimes the hiring manager might have unrealistic expectations. Sometimes you're looking for a perfect person, that unicorn who might not exist, or, they might be looking for exact copy of the person that they're replacing. But to be honest, if that happens, all you can do is to demonstrate that you have the right skills. And you do that by doing the research and providing specific tangible examples of what you've done in a previous position that will be relevant to the job you're applying for. That's really all you can do. The rest is, as I said, completely beyond your control. So
during an interview, what's a good way to provide a tangible example of something you've done in the past?
Okay, so there is a format called STAR, which stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result, which is a really good structure to provide examples of what you've done. So it's basically whenever you ask the competency-based questions, so, tell me of a time when, or give me an example of a situation when. So, I mean, it could be a question like, give me an example of when you've improved the forecasting process, or tell me about a situation when you work with with a difficult colleague, or give me an example of when you manage someone who was difficult. You would use a format called STAR, which stands for situation, task, action, result. So basically, you describe the situation you were in or the task you had to accomplish. Then you talk about your specific actions of what you've done, and then you talk about the result. And the more specific or tangible the result, the better. So if you've done something that saved time or money, mention that. If you've improved the procedure and that saved, 3 days out of every week, or like try to quantify your examples as much as you can. That's probably the biggest mistakes. Like when I see resumes and when I interview candidates, a lot of the time they just talk about what they've done, but not so much about what they've achieved. So you really want to focus on how did you really impact the organization? What have you really achieved? Many resumes are just really duty oriented. People mention what they've done. And especially, it's really competitive these days. So I'll give you an example. Last year, I was recruiting for a finance director. We've received 176 applications.
Wow.
And that was just directly through Expedia's website. That didn't include people that I have contacted myself directly via, LinkedIn and reaching out to people directly. And honestly, out of these 176 people, half of them could probably do the job. But, you can't interview 76, like you can't interview 80 people or whatever, or 90 people. So you really focus on people with best experience, most relevant to the job. So like we were looking for e-commerce experience. And guess how many people who had e-commerce experience out of those who've applied? Maybe 3, So that's what I mean. Like people just apply for jobs without tailoring the CVs to specific positions. So it's really important that when you have experience they're looking for, that it's really visible on page 1 of your CV, of your resume, and also that you have those specific examples.
Yeah, I agree. Especially if you can put in dollars of savings or percentage of time saved or anything like that. Especially that's one of the big tips I give people when I'm telling them how to fix their resume.
Especially like in a finance position, like let's say finance manager, they will be improving maybe the forecasting or the budgeting process. But how have you improved that? Like what was the situation before? How bad was it? Really paint the picture of what the problem was, like how was it impacting the organization? Then what processes, what systems do you put in place to improve the situation? And then what was the result?
Exactly. For instance, in one of my roles, it was I could have just written down, we implemented new, I think it was a business information system. But that doesn't really tell them a whole lot about what I did or how that helped. So it's more of manage team of 5 to implement business information system that improve forecasting accuracy by 10%, so something like that.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was talking about. Absolutely. It's very, very important because imagine how are you going to make yourself stand out? Imagine there are just 20 people applying and there are more, but how are you going to make yourself stand out? Obviously working, having experience, having a stable career history and, having some good brands on your resume, yes, that will help. But at the same time, you still need to be able to make yourself stand out. So how did you make your impact? And it's really easy to explain that when you have some numbers.
So on the topic of standing out, I think a lot of people might be tempted to embellish a little bit on their resume in order to make themselves look a little better. What is your recommendation on that?
Oh, no, I wouldn't recommend that. It's quite easy to like these days, a lot of companies are doing background checks. And even in the interview process, you really need to be able to talk in detail about everything that you put on your resume. So I've had candidates, it obviously happens all the time, either myself or I've heard from the hiring managers, that you ask the candidate about something that they've done. You've asked them about something that they've done, and it's actually quite clear that they haven't really done that to enough extent. Like what they put on the resume, it's not necessarily lying, but maybe they've done something once and we're looking for an expert. Then and that comes out in an interview process. Like you want to show yourself in the best possible light, but I wouldn't do it by lying. Absolutely not.
Whether it's in magazines, your favorite morning show, or on the internet, there's a lot of bad resume and interviewing advice out there. So I asked Margaret to share the biggest myths and misconceptions that she sees keeping qualified candidates from getting the job. So for the resume or the interview process as a whole, what are some common myths that you think people have? I don't know, they've seen it on a blog or they're reading it online somewhere. There's a lot of bad information out there. So what are some myths that you hear a lot that you'd like to dispel today?
Okay, so I think one may be that the most qualified person gets the job. I mean, that should be the case, not always the case. It's like interviewers are looking for someone who can do the job, fit in the culture, and do not cause trouble. So if you can demonstrate that, hopefully you will get the job. But sometimes, you can have fantastic experience, but then maybe during the interview process, you will come across as someone who's really difficult to manage or difficult to get along. I've had that quite a few times, actually. I've seen that the candidate had a really good experience, pretty good answers, but at the same time, it was quite clear that they maybe would be quite difficult to manage or difficult to get along, and they just didn't get the job. So it's quite often, the applicant who comes recommended from an inside source or a personal connection that maybe will get the job, not always the most accomplished candidate. So yeah, it's not just about your ability to do the job. Is it also like, are you gonna get along with others? Would you be easy to work with? So that's definitely one. I think another one potentially that. Sometimes the interviewers aren't prepared, and I'm sure you've had that experience. Like, you imagine that they've read your CV and they pretty much know your resume by heart. Not the case. They might have just run out of another meeting. Maybe they just glanced at your resume last week. I mean, it shouldn't really happen, but it happens.
Especially when there's multiple managers in a department. Sometimes somebody's out sick and they just get last minute like, hey, we need somebody to talk to this guy for 30 minutes to keep him busy.
Prepare for an interview by identifying the problems hinted at in the job ad. And, if there is no job description, like research the company and industry, and then prepare examples of how you will solve them, or give them some examples of how you solved similar problems in a previous job using that style format I've mentioned before. So again, you would just prepare stories of how you solved a similar problem. So that would be one. And similar to that, like many interviewers have never had any interview training. So they ask you these stupid questions like, tell me about yourself, which is just so generic, instead of asking you for some specific examples. So again, in such a situation, prepare several effective sound bites that highlight your past successes and your skills. You don't need to be too detailed, but you just want something catchy and succinct and that's just easy to remember. Just the more examples of what you've achieved you can provide, the better.
And just to clarify, even if they are asking stupid questions, you need to have an answer, right?
Yeah, I mean, you probably do. I mean, it depends what, like a lot of interviews start with, tell me about yourself. I mean, I don't like this question personally because I think it's like a lazy interviewer question. But at the same time, you absolutely do need to have a good answer prepared because a lot of interviews start that way. But at the same time, if you go to a company and they're just asking you these really silly questions, like, do you even want to work there? Maybe not.
Good point.
It's also, it's a two-way street. It's also, as an applicant, it's also for you to evaluate, do you actually want to work there? It's not just them interrogating you. You also need to make sure it's the right organization for you.
And do you have any questions you recommend candidates ask during the interview to find out if it is actually a place they want to work?
Yes, there's so many questions. It's a very good question. There's a lot of questions you can ask to find out. I mean, sometimes you will get an opportunity to ask questions throughout the interview. Sometimes you will get an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So in terms of the company culture, you can actually ask, you can just ask, what's the company culture? What is it like to work here? You can even ask, what is it that you like about working for the organization? What are the main challenges? What the short-term or long-term challenges? So these are the questions you can find out. You can ask what happened to the previous person in the position.
Ooh, I like that one.
Is it a new job? Is it a replacement? You can absolutely ask, if the person got promoted, great. That's obviously will be a chance for you to do the same. But, if you're the fifth person being interviewed for the position because the four previous people have left, that's obviously not a very good sign. Not that they will tell you that, but you still might want to find out who did the job before, what happened to them, why are they looking, now. You can also ask about expectations, what are the priorities of the job. So that's not so much about the company culture, but it will still give you some more information about their expectations and how realistic these expectations are as well.
So I was watching your free interview course. So thank you for that. By the way, I found that on your website. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes so everybody can hop over and sign up for that too. And you mentioned something that jumped out to me, and it was that you need to show enthusiasm during the interview. And as a kind of natural introverted person, it's not my default mode to be out and be kind of all bubbly and smiling and glad-handing. And I just want to know, what is your best recommendation for coming off authentic, but also enthusiastic?
Okay, it's a great question. I think it's extremely important to show some enthusiasm during the interview, but it doesn't mean that you have to be obviously, if you're an accountant or a finance person, you're not going to have the same personality as a sales director, right? It's just a completely different job that requires completely different traits. So it's not about being too energetic and jumping up and down. But at the same time, unless there are so many people who just kind of look bored in an interview, if you're interested in a job, you need to tell them, Honestly, I can't tell you how many times I've seen. In fact, I remember a situation when there were three candidates in the final interview stage, and the one who got the job was actually the least experienced one, but she was the most enthusiastic out of the three candidates. So, like, think of, what's your why? Like, why does this job really interest you? What is it about the company that appeals to you? And you don't need to be like super energetic, but at the same time, even like, how would you be talking to a friend about something you're really, really excited about? And that's the tone of voice you should be using. So just think of a few reasons why you're really interested in the company. Maybe just like modulate your tone of voice a bit as well. Like, don't be really monotonous. So I literally had candidates saying, "Oh, I'm really interested in this job," like in that tone of voice. Like you do need to be able to show some enthusiasm. But just think of, how would you be talking to a friend about something you're excited about? And that's the kind of tone of voice that you should be using.
And do you recommend actually flat out saying, "Hey, I'm very interested in this job for X, Y, and Z reasons," or just keep it on your head?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Even if they don't ask you the question, I would tell them. Yeah, definitely.
I think that comes back to the fit we were talking about earlier. People are more likely to want you around if they know you're excited and really want to
Yeah.
be there. So
Yeah, definitely. Why would you want to work with someone who just doesn't seem at all interested in a job? Like, you don't want someone who's just interested in any job because they're unemployed. You want someone who will actually enjoy that. You want someone that you will actually enjoy working with as well. So,
sometimes the best way to learn is to hear stories about what not to do. Margaret shared some of the things that great candidates have in common, and she has a few horror stories from interviews where the candidate definitely didn't get the job. Pay attention, make sure you don't make the same mistakes that these guys made. Do you have any good stories, or I guess we've kind of covered a few of them, but that exemplify maybe a typical really good candidate or a really bad candidate that you could walk us through?
Yeah. How much time have we got? um, okay, so some examples. I mean, great candidates typically they would have done a lot of research into the company, like they would have prepared relevant examples. It's obviously someone who's very enthusiastic about the company, who you can really tell they're interested in the company. They have put in a lot of thought into why, like where they want their career to go, why they're interested in this specific job, why in this specific company. Again, they would have done, as I mentioned before, I've had this situation when there are three people on the final interview stage. The one who got the job was actually the most enthusiastic one. I had another situation when, again, we had two candidates on interview for a senior position. And again, they both were really strong candidates, really strong example. But the one who got the job was just, again, really enthusiastic and really well prepared. So it's very, very important that you do that. In terms of bad candidates, there were so many. I mean, I've had people who, like, they've done no research on the company whatsoever. Like, they pretty much, they don't even know what the company does, or they just have like a 2-minute look at the website, but they're not really that interested. You can tell. Some of them, I don't even think they read the job description, because they will send you a cover letter. Well, I'll give you an example. Okay, so I'm looking for an account management intern right now, which is basically a role within digital marketing. And basically, people who are applying, they think it's a role in accounting, because clearly they haven't read the job description. So I've already had a few people saying, "Oh, I'm really interested in finance and investments." This job has nothing to do with that. Okay, it's a role within account management team within digital marketing companies. Like, I'm not actually sure what they think. Whether they read the job description or whether they just apply for anything that they think looks relevant. So yeah, they sent. People send cover letters that they still haven't changed the name of the previous company they've applied to.
Oh.
Yeah. Or like they mentioned, they have really good attention to detail and they have spelling mistakes on the resume. Being really negative about the company or a previous boss, that's definitely a no-no. I've had candidates at the interview who are just like really slagging off their boss or the team. I'm like, my God, like, why would you do that? Like, are you going to do the same to us? There was another quite funny situation recently when the candidate, he was doing really well. Like all the interviews, the presentation went really well. And then there was one final interview with what we call a bar raiser interview. It's this concept taken from Amazon where the interview is really a competency-based interview focused on values and competencies. And like, is this person going to be better than, say, 60% of people doing the same job within a company? And that's not really about the skills. It's more like, are you going to be the right fit for the business? Do you have the same values, etc., etc.? So because the feedback was so positive, the interview asked the question like, tell me about some failures or tell me about a failure. So instead of giving just one example of something that didn't work, the candidate just went on and on for about 20 minutes. But the examples he gave, that was just, I just wish I've witnessed that. I've had the interview feedback. So he basically did quite a lot of unethical things. Like, for example, he was once working for this company, and I think he was just selling some non-existing ad space, or then I think he sold someone, he was selling some hip replacements, and I think he sold the wrong size or something like that. And then it was just so bad. It was just so bad. And then he continued for a few months. So instead of like leaving immediately knowing what the company was like, he actually continued for quite a few months because apparently, he needed the money. But it was just like, just the lack of integrity was quite apparent. He even said to me during the interview, well, I lied to my boss about... So he basically, instead of just taking a day off, you're entitled to have a day off to come in for, to do whatever. He actually said, I actually lied to my boss to be able to come here today. Like, why would you even say that? Yeah, so that was the most recent. Example.
All right, that's a good one.
I had another one when a candidate mentioned, I was interviewing a candidate, and he suggested himself that I speak to the person that we hired a month earlier because they used to work together. And he probably thought I wouldn't do that. He just thought, okay, well, I'm sure she won't do that. So anyway, I finished the call. I called this other guy that he said they used to work together. He can provide reference. And the guy just like went silent. He just said, I can't believe he asked you to speak to me. He had some mental health problems. I fired him. There's just a lot of examples of bad candidates.
Unfortunately, there's probably more of those than the great candidates, but that's what makes the great candidates stand out, right?
Absolutely. Honestly, it's not very difficult to stand out. Like, even when I mentioned you get these 176 applications or whatever, it's actually quite easy to see like a really good resume that's specifically tailored to the position, that you really emphasize, you use the right keywords, it's really achievements oriented. It's actually not that difficult to make yourself stand out.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time here, and I want to make sure we don't run over. But the last thing I want to know is, where's the best place for people to find you online if they want to learn more about interviewing or even connect with you about possibly doing some coaching?
Oh, sure. So my website is www.interview-coach.co.uk. So interview-coach.co.uk. I have a lot of free resources on my website, including free e-course about how to win at job interviews. I have a free video course. Again, I think that's the one you referred to earlier. And that's at youarehiredvideocourse.com. But the link is also on my website. So there's a lot of free resources for people interested in improving their skills.
Awesome. Well, we'll include links to all of that in the show notes for today's show. All right, Margaret, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks again to Margaret for coming on the show. If you want to learn more about how to interview, Margaret has some great resources to get you started. You can find links to her site and everything else we just talked about in the show notes for this episode at abacusshow.com/7. Each episode, I like to share a little tip or tidbit that, while probably not life-changing, will hopefully help you out in some small way. This is Coaching Notes. Earlier in this episode, you learned some great tips to help you ace your next interview. But if you're looking for a job, there's something you need to do before you can even get the interview. That's right, you'll need a great resume to get your foot in the door. The good news is that crafting a great resume is easier than you think. The bad news is there's so much awful advice out there in magazines and online that it's hard to know where to start. And that's why I've created the Accounting Resume Myths course. This free course gives you the basics of writing an accounting resume and busts some of the biggest resume myths you'll come across. And it's free for Abacus listeners. Enroll today by visiting cpatalent.com/courses. And that's your coaching note.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, it's fast and easy to click on that 5-star rating in iTunes or your podcatcher of choice. And don't forget, you can get links and show notes for everything we covered today, or check out all of our past episodes by visiting abacusshow.com. See you next time.